Zach from Gravel Bike California, here in the middle of Rock Cobbler, where I forgot to shoot an intro. Today, I think we're in for a much better ride because I'm already into it, but not as much saturation as the other years. Also, early course reviews might be a little bit less technical, but it's really about the second half on this one. Plus, the hike a bike, maybe one of the worst. So, no extra hand. I'm rolling. Rock cobblers are always hard, but I was pretty eager for this edition, worried that some eye irritation would keep me out 72 hours ahead. Instead, last minute maintenance was the biggest impediment I had to overcome. For 12.0, the biggest difference was the starting point almost 10 miles to the east in the heart of the hills. The first 14 miles would be fast, but would it be hard to keep groups together? With rain coming in a couple days before, it was more the conditions than the numbers to worry about around Breckenridge. Rancheria Road was a steady climb and a rare opportunity to dictate your own tempo. Pyramid Road offered some stunning back roads experientially in multiple ways. The Ranchlands was the toughest region of the day, not just for the main climbs, but the pitches in between. Whipping around the pavement was a nice reprieve, but there was reason to call it quits here. Hart Park was short and most memorable thanks to the refrigerator and the annual hike-a-bike. Once back to pedaling, it was a series of high notes all the way in. All in all, we felt the 9,300 feet of climbing, but it was far more palatable than the year before. The heat is on, but it wasn't doing much good. Even Sam needing a wake-up call to get going. With the longer boulder ticking off earlier using a Le Mans style start, definitely having the effect of splitting up their group, already cooking the pace, riding a dozen miles more than me, though we had the luxury of a warmer start, also because being packed into closer quarters, and maybe the return of my devilish number. Our cobbler wave had more to maneuver over the starting line, glad for a smoother rollout without having to run for our bikes, as it was good vibes across the board, even with the natural anxiety of riding in a pack. But I did want to stay out in front before we hit dirt 3.5 miles in. That was thwarted by me trying to fix my rear camera while keeping pace, with the pressure picking up as we turned off of Alfred Harrell Highway, thinking the dirt roads would provide opportunity to move up, but our instructions told us to first follow the arrows, not our GPS. And while this last minute add-on made us pedal an extra mile more, it was so much fun that Sam gets a pass for going off script. The jets did cool as we returned back onto course. Glad I did make the selection of riders across this closure, just wanting to keep the legs moving, having a piece of strategery going into these 3 miles of dirt to stay connected with a group by the time we hit road, which was hard to do while filming, paired with handling all of these rollers. That was not as easy as it looked. The unexpected threat of rain lurked as a possibility, while untimely mechanicals was more of a concern. With this momentum-sucking hill, my upcoming burden. But these short punchy climbs aren't good for someone like me in this weight class, ending up further behind than when I went into it. Burned some bullets. Turning onto Breckenridge Road started a 4-mile climb, but a majority of it was at below 2%, meaning I'd rather be drafting if I could get position, even if I had to beg for magical powers, as I seemed to be just far enough away until we reached our crossing a half of the way up, Now back in the graces of this handful, saying goodbye to the farmlands behind, transitioning to the ranches in the foothills, realizing I had to dial it down a little bit, knowing that taxing myself early would hurt exponentially later on. This mile reprieve was welcomed enough, also marking our disengagement with pavement for a while, hitting 12 miles of dirt in the traditional Breckenridge backlands that also marked the start into private holdings, noting we had 5 miles until we reached the peak that was mostly the same as 2 years ago, except for the first third that had a similar rolling hills profile, staying a little more above the fray, with long shadows commanding only an hour into the ride. Past these gates started one of my most anticipated segments of the day. Not that this 3-mile climb was daunting at 5.5%, but how 2 years ago this canyon was transformed into a mud pit. That's the closest thing to being Green Day at Woodstock. There was a big concern for more of the same today, with some rainfall coming in the middle of the week, and while curve after curve, it was hard to see what's ahead. Overall conditions were as perfect as they could get, except being an hour into the ride, things were far more lonelier than ever before, so it was nice to have a couple of riders pass, wondering if there was some far-off catastrophe keeping me solo. While the peak is a grind, like most I skipped the first aid station, ready to have an honest take on this 3-mile downhill that was too wet to use the road last time out. And even though it wasn't as emerald as before, I was pretty sure I was going to enjoy these 3 miles more than the last. I definitely appreciated the fun this go around, but we still had dirt to tackle on this side of the 178 that I enjoyed the best on this edition. Not that we didn't have work to do here, still needing to summon my bottom gears, but I was glad we weren't climbing as high up the hill as other editions, while still getting some downhill benefits as well, with our rockiest section so far to cobble. The good thing about being a semi-veteran here is the familiarity of the terrain and getting ahead of when you can let go of the brakes, but also knowing when I could use a particular camera. And it was harder shooting today as people were more spread out, and I'm talking about riders because Sam has an amazing number of volunteers out there, not to mention men made out of tacos. I mistook the solar panels as the river from afar, but it's a good thing the Cobbler has the best course markings, because it's far easier to focus on those than constantly looking down at your GPS. I knew this 178 crossing wouldn't need to be controlled, but the question was how much water would be flowing through. Nice that these climbs didn't put me in the red yet, with the mighty Kern River below, rewarding with views, doing our regular exit out of the Breckenridge segment, but not without some good-natured ribbing.
You sure? Okay.
Those that did the Pebbler made a direct line to Hart Park that had their own separate aid station, led by the Grizzly Cycles crew, fully stocked for all nutrition, being on top of properly judging today's antics, and setting up a home away from home. But of course they added something special, setting up a photo booth for those that missed out on their bike prom, as yeah, I want to be with the cool kids too. I was ready for our Rancheria Road portion of the ride, though I didn't need to ask for advice, having ridden beyond with Alejandro from Cumbre all the way up to Oak Flat a few summers ago, but it should be obvious crossing the Kern we were bottoming out, starting our nearly 5-mile climb with good sight lines to see what's ahead, because there are also other vehicles using the road and impediments to keep livestock in, not veering off far from its 4.5% average. Everyone was enjoying the opportunity to spin their legs, with Rancheria switching its composition before the halfway point, but the change in surface didn't affect us much, transitioning to the hills, tapering themselves back, and the occasional rockscape introducing itself. This was a nice way to clock off some of the day's elevation, starting to feel like I was rejuvenating myself, making our turn just as Boulder leader Pete Stetna was coming back down, but I was choosing to use the pit stop this time, going for a full refuel while being more efficient than other years, even spurning the rig toss, although the money would be nice. Technically, there was another half-mile to climb, but we were entering one of the newest areas of the Cobbler, returning to the Round Mountain area from last year, this time going further northeast up Pyramid Road where nothing looked like it had been touched, except for the mini pies, which would be impossible to avoid for the duration, and while crossing over the ridge, took away some of the innocence. No complaints for the thrills over the next 1.5 miles. It's reassuring to have people looking out for us, as far off as we were, although it's a service here not provided 365 days a year. But I was familiar from here on out, merging with the segment from last year in the opposite direction, punctuated with the large sweeping hills, without the overwhelming greenery of last year. Though these painfully steep inclines were still presents, I chose not to ride the most taxing parts, instead staying fresh for the more nominal ones, knowing that the recovery times were minimal, glad to have momentum more on my side. No one needed to justify this anomaly of flatness, ready for that one last descent out of this sector, with a view we weren't going to get for the rest of the day, closing the door on our Round Mountain segment that apparently included one of my water bottles as well. Our riding on the open road was brief, with our next climb waiting on the other side, having just passed today's midpoint, though the second half would be more robust.
The numbers don't lie, unless they're numbers.
There were 3 major climbs in the northern Ranchlands, with the first clocking in at 1 3/4 miles at 6%, but after a consistent first half, the particulars get skewed, presented with this flat reprieve, as the surroundings look just as inconsistent, with the end of this ascent emphasized with this extreme peakage, setting the tone until our next rest stop. The next 2 miles were laden with extremes, with a number of soul-sucking peaks to contend, gazing up at the ridgelines that look romantic from below, though reaching them is quite the strain in practice, meaning you might need a second look at the ride profile that'll likely overlook these steep offerings, but your body won't forget. At least the panoramas are appealing, and if you grind enough, there is payoff. Even if it's just 5 minutes of fun, you'll take it. There was a short directional and elevation transition before our next climb, but glad still to have gravity on our side for a while, with a deviation from our recent visual selection, rolling by this ranch complex, making me feel a little like being home. But our second major climb of the Ranchlands awaited, with this dip making you understand why the 6% average was deceiving, though at just under a mile was the shortest categorized in this region, reinforcing my "this is just temporary" mantra. And I couldn't tell if the speed limit sign was a joke, but the entertainment value on the single track wasn't. The timing of that high note hit the spot, coming up on our last pit stop of the day. And while I was hoping it would be a short one, I got caught up in the antics.
Still love you.
And then technical difficulties made a 16-minute stop that I almost had to pay rent for. After that setback, I start our longest climb of the Ranchlands, clocking in at just under 4 miles. That at least was only at 3%, but it was still climbing at this point, just focusing on clocking off the miles. Glad I still had energy in the tank, because when you get tired physically, you make mistakes mentally, sometimes not aware of the simple crevasse you should avoid. Of course, the peak was the pitchiest of this climb, with the last 7 miles of this region of the thumbs up variety, unless you're trying to limbo under your own bike, as the majority of the remainder increased your average speed, where the undulations are gently pleasing, feeling like I was on a carpeted planet, but the flow was somewhat interrupted by the sliver of single track with a dubious start, though once I could release the brakes, it was time to make memories of the good variety, but you had to watch out for the bones of the bovine. After that stretch, spirits were at an all-time high. Even without the reminder, all of us do love gravel, especially with these shorter efforts, as this little hilltop gave a quick look at our last test ahead, leaving our final portion of today's private lands, hoping for an expedited last 16 miles. Despite the headwind, the flat pavement more than made up for it, with Phineas doing his all to raise my spirits, and everyone else with my heart rate glad to jump on this train, getting us quickly back towards Alfred Harrell Highway. But I should have predicted this detour, returning back into Ethel's without charging admission, but I did pass on the beverages, being so close to the end. After speeding down the highway, we merged back with the Pebblers in Hart Park, and yes, we definitely had some more climbing to do, but this was the main ascent we'd be doing here on a bike that after a long day in the saddle was nice to have company, though looking down below, feeling like I was waiting in line at an amusement park, knowing the best 2 minutes of the day lie ahead, ready to take in the jovial refrigerator segment that I rode last month, but this time with no one in front to ride it as I may. Definitely, that is one of the most uniquely playful stretches of dirt anywhere. And if there wasn't a smile on your face, you did it wrong. Though passing above Hart Park Lake was a signal for those that knew that everything of the Type 1 fun variety was coming to an end, with the mad scientist here to watch his creation.
Thanks, Sam.
As this was visually the most impossible looking hike-a-bike so far, hard to comprehend how to even start. With no clear rules of engagement how to tackle this, other than seeing how far brute force could take you, and the frisbee golf was irrational enough to provide some distraction. With my back hurting, I just bit my lip and plowed on, heading up toward salvation, which is not right with these crazy mechanisms in our hands. And maybe it was my determination being a major factor, even as the peak was the worst part. Eliminating the moments where I came close to giving up got me up there faster than I could even imagine. While there was a little climbing after, it still brought our pulses down, obviously needing a descent here to get us out of Hart Park. And even though the playful level was high, it was not enough to get that vertical taste out of our mouths. Crossing under the highway, knowing at least the rest was bearable, glad to jump on a pace train for these last 3 miles, relying on that final rush of adrenaline to get us home, and that unnecessary final pitch only making sense in a rock cobbler way, as the new finish brought the same old feelings with the post ride. Always a big highlight of this event, not just for the fresh hearty meal awaiting, but how it's like a high school reunion, except it's people you know from across the state that might also be here camping out, as you could pull up to any table to share war stories, where we'll all be back the second Saturday of February for another rock cobbler. Well, what can I say? I'm so glad my eye came through, because I thought this was going to be a special course, and it was. I mean, first of all, I do prefer going counterclockwise on Breckenridge, and conditions do play a big part, but just so much playfulness. And yeah, there was hard parts too, but I don't know, I'm standing still, so I guess I definitely cobbled. Anyways, now support us, hit subscribe button, go to our shop, or support us on Patreon so we can bring you more. The State of Dirt.